Great pleasure and honor to be here, and thanks everybody for having us in. Taking a look at the folks attending, great to see some old colleagues and some friends. So thanks very much for joining us today. In my role as the Executive Director for Enterprise Identity Services for Employment and Social Development Canada, like such a monstrous title, I work for the department that delivers approximately $180 billion in social aid benefits to Canadians annually. So this includes your Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, Employment Insurance, Canadian Financial Assistance Programs, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of an insider threat is something very, very near and dear to my heart because it is of a massive significance and concern. For the purpose of today's presentation, Dr. Lokanan and I, we want this to be interactive. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt us, feel free to chime in. Come off your mics. I think a lot of us are MS Teams and or Zoomed to death when it comes to traditional presentations. We're certainly going to give you lots of information, but just feel free to come on in and have that dialogue and have that interaction with us. When we talk about our resources, right, we talk about corporate governance, and we talk about public sector, private sector enterprises, our number one resource is always said to be what? It's always said to be our people. Right. So what if that actually was to become our number one liability as well? The biggest risk, the biggest problem. I've already highlighted that professionally I work for ESDC that gives those social benefits out. Additionally, in my job, I'm actually responsible for the modernization of the social insurance registry. Social insurance registry has more than 30 million records in it, and of course is about the largest database of public information held on Canadians and clients, indeed internationally, in our entire holding registry for the federal government. Imagine, if you will, that I decide I am no longer happy with my job, and so I'm going to sell a copy of this database. By my position, I have the ability, I have the access, I have the knowledge. What would be the impact to the government of Canada? What would be the impact to you, the citizenry? All of that information sold and gone. That's some of the research that I'm working on with Mark, that we're trying to put in predictive methods for detecting insider threats as a means of reducing threat risk to organizations, whether public sector or private. I'll start sharing my screen. All right. I'd like to announce to you that I am presenting today from the Ottawa region, which is the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm absolutely honored to be here to do that. So first, we're going to talk about what is defining the insider threat. What are we looking at? What are we talking about? What do we know about insider threats? What do we know about the personality traits that meet some of those folks? Are there ways that we can actually detect, but also things that mitigate against them? I'm going to talk about history of it within a Government of Canada context and look at kind of the overview of current insider threat detection programs and where we need to actually advance the research further. So what is an insider threat? The CERT Institute in the United States were some of the earlier pioneers when it came to insider threats. And they look at persons within your organization who are subverting the confidentiality and integrity of your systems. Public Safety Canada looks at somebody who has the knowledge of your infrastructure, physical computer security or physical security computer networks, and they use basically ill-gotten gains for their own personal advantage. So most simply summarized, it's somebody who's already in your employ. You've vetted them, you've hired them, you've checked the references. In the case where you have a security screening program, you've already done that, you've done leadership assessments, et cetera, et cetera. They're inside your walls, and they're going to use their privileged access to do harm. So what do we know about insider threats? Let me ask you, I'm going to kick back a slide, make this more interactive. When you think about some of the crazy people out there in the world, what are some of the personality traits that you think go along with that? And so fire away in the chat, let me know what you think. What are some of the things that are associated with insider threats that you've seen? And if nobody responds, I'll just keep chirping on anyway. All right, nothing coming up fast. So what are we talking about? We're talking about dark triad personality traits. So these have been linked through research to be psychopathology, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. So you think about your Donald Trumps of the world, right? Clearly a narcissist, clearly Machiavelli. Argue certainly that it has psychological or psychopathological tendencies. So looking at individuals that'll use people without any thought of consequence to that person's well-being. When you talk about somebody who's narcissistic, oftentimes they are indeed charming at first glance. They actually build very, very quick relationships because of their willingness to be manipulative, their willingness to be adaptive. They build high-performing teams, believe it or not, but usually at the expense of burning these teams out because they have no regard for their actual intent and well-being. When you look at your organizations and where you work, can you think about people in leadership positions that actually have these tendencies? I'm sure as I ask the question, there is people saying, yeah, I can actually think of people who have those tendencies. So what does that mean? Well, there's research that actually indicates that the people with these personality traits do pose a risk in the sense of an insider threat. But at the same time, people with these traits can also actually be some of your higher achieving performers. So what's the differentiation between the two? How do you define somebody who is narcissistic to the point that they will leverage against people versus narcissism on the other side, where it's the confidence leader or the fearless professional? Right? How do you make that distinction? How do you make that differentiation between the two so that you can actually have a protection program in place? One of the things I'm looking at are social bonds. So social bonds, as first posited by Hershey and Gottfredson, look at somebody's attachment, commitment, involvement, their beliefs, their ethics. They have suggested that in youth, your attachment to your family, your attachment to your community, this sets an early pattern towards success. Were you disciplined as a child? Were you taught right from wrong? Do you have a commitment to your community or even your neighborhood? Are you involved in cultural aspects? Were you involved in team sports? Did you have that guidance from a broader sense, thinking beyond yourself, being able to actually view the world in a way that looked at the collective good over your own personal good? And again, that involvement in that shape of things. And again, your general ethical proclivity. Are you actually bound morally by right or wrong? Do you actually get the true sense in yourself of a behavior that is going to be of a benefit to yourself versus an impediment to society? And does that actually propel you to stop a certain activity or an action? Because Gottfredson and Hershey looked at these things from being just in your youth, there's a bit of a limiter in that. And I think we can all agree, your life is not necessarily defined by your early patterning. Indeed, as you move through life, your life course, your journey can change. You can get into stable relationships. You can form that new family unit that gives you that bond, that kind of later in life bond to the unit. You can develop a career that's satisfying, that gives you that commitment to your team, that gives you a commitment to society as a whole. So it argues that we can't look at social bonds just from the baseline of your youth. We have to be able to consider the fact that you can develop these things through time. And so is it the case where somebody with insider threat personality traits and strong social bonds will tend towards being able to succeed versus the person who has these insider threat traits and has weaker social bonds will have a tendency toward a bad action, a threat action? Chatty, your hand, sir.
Yeah, but that's like saying guilty till proven innocent. What you can do about that person? You cannot fire them. You cannot do anything because in reality, they do not perform the action, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, if we look at it, a number of private enterprises. So Amazon Canada, AWS, Amazon Worldwide Services, screens for leadership during an application process. Any job you're going into, you're going to be asked questions. It's not actually knowing you as a leader. It's not knowing if you actually have those leadership capabilities. It's using a psychometric evaluation to assess whether you have the leadership principles that they think are appropriate. If you don't, you're screened out. There's no appeal. There's no evaluation against that. Not dissimilar to organizations that have security screening processes in place. You apply, somebody does research in your background, has nothing necessarily to do directly with your employment, but if you've got a bad credit history, you don't get the job. Happens in banks, happens in a number of industries. So it's not so much a matter of guilty until proven innocent. It's about, as with your organization, right, looking at risk. What is the risk threshold that an organization is willing to allow? Can you afford a risk entered into your organization? And I'd say ethically, no, you can't. If I was allowed the access that I have without there being some degree of assessment against my integrity and my reliability, and it came to the light of day that I had indeed sold the social insurance registry, it would lead to a significant decrease in the confidence of government to actually succeed in being government. One guy sitting here presenting to you today could literally lead to a decrease in the belief that people have that government can actually protect you. It's critical that we have these things in place. Chatty.
I raised my hand too much, but I'm worried about. I think, well, I took MBA I finished last year. Now Microsoft managing the government database, that's worrying me. The Canadian government database, that is really worrisome. I don't know if that's true or not, but why the Canadian government, they don't have their own data centers or so? I believe they can afford it. It's not that expensive. It is expensive, but not that expensive. But now our faith in the hands of a private enterprises, I don't know. I'm asking you, maybe you know more than me.
So I'm going to keep us on task for the presentation at hand, as opposed to, venturing into procurement mechanisms of the government of Canada and who wins contracts and who doesn't. I'll say that Microsoft does not run our data centers. I'll dispel a myth there. That's not a truth. But in the case of where we have relationships with vendors, it's because of an open procurement process for a need of a service that the government isn't doing. But it's all open building with security requirements. So is this a reality? When I talk about social bonds, I talk about threat, I talk about the dark triad personality traits, and you find yourself sitting there saying, oh, come on, Bill, this can't be a real thing. This can't be something that's widespread. Well, recent cases will show you that in front of the courts right now, indeed, during the COVID-19 pandemic response in the province of Ontario, there's a computer engineer who's alleged to have left a vulnerability in the software solution that he developed that allowed him to misappropriate $11 million in funds into different accounts that he had created. Again, an allocation yet tested before the courts. Indeed, there was a event where a gentleman decided he wanted to have a conversation with the Prime Minister of Canada, somebody who is a Canadian Forces member, a reservist. So again, subject to a screening, subject to a vetting, that drove his car from from Manitoba to Rideau Hall, where he was arrested on site. Recently as well, again, an allegation yet untested in front of the courts. Cameron Ortiz, the Director General of their intelligence program, is alleged to have been selling secrets to organized crime interests. And again, you're talking now somebody who would have been subject to a polygraph and the highest degree of security vetting that the government offers. And I would suggest it's a higher degree than what any private industry offers as well. Further, you've got Jeffrey DeLille. Jeffrey DeLille was convicted and has been released from prison since of selling secrets to the Russians. So he was an intelligence officer working for the Canadian Forces, first in Ottawa and then in Halifax. And it's not alleged, he did indeed sell information to Russia for a number of years. This is real. It's in our organizations right now. And in fact, when you look at it more globally, it's actually responsible for more than $200 billion a year in lost revenue based on identity thefts and other such activities. So what are the current insider threat programs? What's the problem with them, from my view? When we look at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, NIST, they're really the North American leader when it comes to standards related to anything from a technological perspective. In Canada, we have something called the ITSEGs, the IT Security Guides. They look at the fact that you have to be able to identify a threat, protect it, detect it, respond to it. But a lot of these things are based on the fact that we're looking at the events a posteriori. So after they've happened, you've got an insider who's in your organization, they've entered a database, you've detected that they've entered the database, and you've been able to use system logs to take a look at that, but it's happened, it's gone, it's too late. Even some of the newer technologies, deep belief net, botnet activities that are looking at using smart intelligence for patterning of when people are accessing, should they have the frequency, even for people who do have the lawful, or rather the reasonable rights to be accessing these things, it's still all reacting to that. There was a white paper that was done up that looked at insider threat programs, and it actually said, look, acknowledging that we know that there is certain psychological profiles, the reality is it's too hard to test these things, so we just can't do it. Well, that left me when I wrote that paper thinking that, just because something's difficult doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing it. You have to. If you know there's a means to detect, if you know there's a means to protect, then ethically, you're obliged to put a program in place that can actually be predictive in nature, that can actually reduce your threat risk as an organization, instead of sitting back and waiting for your risk to respond. So really, what are we looking at when it comes to this research? I left this one line up there, the Davidson in 1988. Think of how long ago that was. And it was at $100 billion a year. The United States alone last year, in their employment insurance program, or what they call unemployment insurance, lost $100 billion last year. Globally, as I said, this is in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. To Chaddy's point earlier, guilty before proven innocent, we already do integrity testing. We already do screening for folks. We already do leadership evaluations before hiring. These practices have been shown that when you pair these screenings with proper HR practices, they actually increase the performance of your organizations because they increase the integrity of your organizations. Screening programs are fundamental. They are baseline for just about any industry, and certainly for any industry where there's a high value or a high risk proposition, they are an absolute. So to not screen for a vulnerability is in fact to ignore it. And I would say that this puts most organizations in an absolute liability of their fiduciary responsibilities. So absolutely, absolutely critical. So I will turn the floor over. So Chatty, pardon me.
I thought there's some organization, they don't allow you to download anything. Is that in a place still, or because I thought I remember when I worked, I think at General Motors in Detroit, a lot of these data you cannot download, and that was back in 2005. I don't know, or maybe should we have a separate department? And then why somebody, you only can feed the data, not extract from it, and then if you want something, you would have a separate department that only manage this. But again, you're going to increase employment costs and stuff like that.
I'd say there's a lot of complexities there, and there is no generic baseline. So as an example, a low-level worker may not have a right to download something, but certainly in organizations, you have folks that do have the ability to download all of those pieces of information. In fact, you actually have to, from a business continuity perspective. Every organization has users that have a super user status, master user status, however the lingo is, because you have folks that are working directly on your servers. You have folks that are directly able to mirror these things, be able to make direct copies of it. Because if not, you're leaving yourself vulnerable that if the system collapses, it was only a one line of defense. So I would suggest, obviously not knowing every single organization, I would suggest it would be a common practice that you indeed have folks in all organizations who have that degree of access and have that degree of capability. So at a low level, but more broad spectrum, you're going to have individuals that use access to database for their own personal benefit. Example, If we had somebody in a Service Canada center who could pull up your employment insurance information because they wanted to know the financial status of a spouse that they were in a divorce proceedings with. It seems like a fairly low level event, and indeed on the grand scale of things, it's not significant. But to the taxpayer, the breach of trust, and again, the impact to the reputational risk to the government that employees were doing these things would be fairly significant. And then you can go up in scale on the mid and to the high level of what is the degree of impact to certain breaches. All right, are there any other questions before I turn over to Mark? All right, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Just to level set where we are at. So what you've seen is a theoretical overview of insider threat. And this part of the webinar basically will be looking at what are we trying to do here? What's our intention? And so at the very basic level, I just want to start off by saying building an algorithm to detect insider threat might be something new, but there are algorithms out there, similar algorithms that have been used in different domains. So very recently, I've just built one to detect investment fraud in Canada. That's a big project, and perhaps that will be made available to the public pretty soon. And I've also worked in one, as Bill talked about initial screening, worked in one to build an algorithm that will help human resource officers, personnel predict certain behaviors in pilots for the aviation industry. So this is really nothing new. It's just that in terms of this domain, it has never been applied to detect insider threat before. So the key here is when you're building an algorithm, you want to ask yourself a very basic question. How accurate will your data be? How accurate will this algorithm be in or when applied to new or unlabeled data? So think about it. Let's take a senior secretary of a department, for example. You have new data, what we call no tag data, perhaps a CV or a resume that comes your way. Think about it. If you have a software in front of you that you can easily enter, all the demographic, the psychological traits that Bill talked about, and sociological construct or traits or variables into that model, that will give you a number that I'll talk more about later, in which you can detect or you can, scrutinize or evaluate whether this individual will be potential insider or not. So the key here is this. We want to maximize or be precise with our prediction, right? It's called false positive. And at the same time, minimize incorrect classification. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. Bill, can you move to the next slide, please? All right, so again, what are we trying to do here? The basic aim, the basic objective, the basic problem here is that we want to classify a potential candidate as an insider threat or not. And to do this, we will be using a gamut of variables, right? So in terms of demographics, we'll be looking at, for example, age, gender, education level, occupation, psychological profile. Bill talked about a few: psychopathology, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and then more importantly, sociological construct, right? So bond to society, life course theory, and all the other indicators that comes with those constructs. But I just want to pause for a minute here to highlight something, that we have similar measures that have been used already in a lot of domains. The difference between our proposed algorithm and the ones that are presently in certain industry is that they're mostly psychological profiling algorithm, right? So there's hardly, you may find some demographic variables in there, but the sociological part, the macro, what I call the macro level of analysis, is totally absent from, I would say, significantly most of these, the present algorithm that is out there to predict any kind of human behavior. And so our criteria for success is, as Bill said, we want to reduce, we got to be proactive, right? So we want to reduce the number of insider threats in an organization. It could be private, it could be government or institutes like this one here. And to add another layer of security, right? So when you look at the scope, so some people may ask question, okay, so what does this all mean again in terms of solution? Well, we will be able to predict the kind of threats that a secretary, for example, will be in a position to evaluate later on, in terms of bringing on somebody on board or conducting some human evaluation of that individuals and so on. And as I said, the key here is that you want to minimize the instances of insider threat. Again, to be proactive with respect to the risk threshold of the organization. Now this is not an easy task, right? Like we're dealing here with some very, very complex coding. And so in order to do that, there will be constraints. One of the first constraints is that when you're dealing with algorithm, you need the data. And the data must have two things. One, you must have a representative sample of the entire population and representative features. So what I mean by features, well, as I've said previously, most of the current frameworks out there, not necessarily algorithm, but frameworks out there are built on psychological features, right? What we are proposing is one that takes into consideration the demographic profile of the individual, as well as the sociological profile of the individuals. And there will be a lot of stakeholders who perhaps will be interested in this whole venture. Government is one, private organization, academia, and professional institute. But the key data source here is all dependent on source data. And I think I need to pause a little to explain exactly what I mean by source data. Well, when you're building an algorithm, it's mostly built on using historical data, right? And in this case, what we're looking at a large enough sample so that we can train the data set on a particular sample and test it on the same sample. So think of it like this. Many of you, perhaps all of you, went to colleges and universities. Back in the days, you had perhaps multiple choice exams and so on, right? And think of that, perhaps most of the students in the class who asked the professors for, do you have a mock exam? Do you have a, whatever you want to call it, like a makeup exam or a mirror exam? So what the professor would probably do, he has an exam bank of maybe 100 questions, and you probably pick 25 questions to test you on, mock exam, makeup exam, whatever, right? So he will train you on that exam, and in the test, hopefully this is a professor with integrity, will give you another set of exam questions, not necessarily the same question, right? If, however, he give you the same questions in that exam, then that is called data leakage, right? So that is the thing that we have to guard against in building this algorithm. We got to make sure that the individuals that we're training the algorithm on are not the same individuals, or not the same data or observation that we will be testing it on. Next slide, Bill. All right, so how can you use this product? So how can somebody, who doesn't understand or know about algorithm and AI and whatnot use this product? Well, what we are proposing to do here is, and again, I'm mirroring what I've done in previous industry, for example, the latest one on fraud. We have a rating scale of 1 to 5, right? And we want to represent new observation or new data point as prospective insider, okay? And so the idea is you need to scale whatever output the algorithm spits out. So let's say, for example, you are working in a particular organization and you decide, you know what, my risk threshold is 4.5, right? So you will flag those as potential insider, right? So that's 90% evidence. Or maybe, you know what, you have higher risk threshold and you might say, well, no, 4 or 3.5 or 80% evidence or whatever you want, right? So what will happen at this point is that HR will flag this data. I'm hoping this is a procedure, will flag this particular individual. You're being proactive, by the way. And then you will conduct a human-centered evaluation on that particular individual. So the key in conducting your evaluation is, again, to understand what I've said before, right? We want to make sure that we reduce the individuals that are wrongly flagged and insiders not detected. That's the key. But again, the main point to understand here is that you will have a rating scale to work with. Now, I can't tell you exactly what your threshold should be. As an organization, you should know what your threshold should be, 80%, 85%, 90%. But the key is that you want to minimize incorrect classification. Next slide, Bill. All right, so in terms of the algorithm pipeline, I'm going to answer that question in a minute. So can you, in terms of the algorithm pipeline, what you have here is that you will have, for example, I'll put HR, but it could be somebody else. You'll have an HR professional entering the data from the CV into the algorithm. And then the algorithm will spit out a score, right? So here I put out 3, it could be 4 on a scale of 1 to 5. And then you would eventually, based on that score, decides what you want to do. You want to shut the applicant down there. You want to do some more investigation, some more qualitative research on the individual and so on. So you're not going to be doing or working with any codes. You just be working with data, source data at the entry point. Next slide, Bill. Okay, so in summary, we're trying to build here an end-to-end predictive algorithm to predict insider threat. And our model will be based on data, broadly speaking, that capture the demographic profile of the individual, the psychological profile, as well as the sociological profile. The bottom line, however, in all of this is that we're not using existing framework. We're trying to put some science into this process to build an algorithm that will have, more or less a high accuracy in terms of prediction and minimizing your false positive and false negative scores. Next slide, Bill. I think this is question period. Yep. Thank you.
I have a question. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. So since last so many years, like what we see, the changes which are happening and the trends which are happening into the industries, what do you think that the people are not now the loyal, or because earlier also there were a lot of companies in the big companies, also even in small companies, the people were working very honestly, and nowadays this type of threats are coming too much to the industry. What do you think that whether the earlier people were more loyal than the right now, or what could be the root cause of that?
I would suggest it's not so much about the loyalty or the fealty of folks. I'd say that the ability to have a much broader negative impact against an organization is what's driving the need. If we took 20, 30 years ago, the early advent of computers was one thing with pieces of data versus now, where from a digital network, The portals I control are running anywhere between 140,000 transactions a day up to 1 million a day. And so the amount of data, the amount of digital data in the economy, and so the ability to actually affect a negative outcome for people is what's changed. So it's that one person could have caused a little bit of damage 30, 40, 50 years ago, whereas that one person, if they have the right access and the right status in an organization, can have an absolutely catastrophic effect.
I also wish to point out that two attendees, one is Mario Banks and another is Logan Danielsen. They have both written in the chat for questions. So I guess Logan has mentioned a few things, so perhaps he can also raise his hand, so perhaps he can speak first.
Hi, it's Logan. Thank you. I put 2 or 3 questions in the chat while the presentation was happening, so I just wanted to remind the speakers about that.
Perhaps Logan, since you're on the mic, you might as well speak so that everybody can enjoy your dialogue with the speakers. Thank you.
So Logan, to your first question about running the algorithm and you determine there's a risk that you already know within your organization. I can say, as somebody who's still in the throes of my research, I first got to prove the linkage. How an organization is actually going to employ the algorithm, how they're going to put that into their HR process and practice is something we would have to work with organizations on a one-to-one level with. So I often joke with Mark and say, once we actually prove this, then we become millionaires by actually selling our services to organizations to see how they want to implement it. But more seriously, beyond that, it's really about how would you work with the organization to implement a process to affect that change. So I don't think there is a way to answer that because there would be no standard approach to any organization to the first question.
And just to add to that, Bill, I mean, I just want people to understand that you can't take away the human-centered evaluation from this. So whatever we have implemented, there's still going to be a decision to be made, right? You still have some qualitative research to do, background check on the individuals like most company does. The algorithm in itself is providing you insight data for you to analyze, right? You have to understand this is data. You also have to analyze the data, okay? And then somebody else asked about, can you give an example where this have been used in the past 24 months? Well, in terms of 24 months, I can't, but we have build similar algorithm, as I've said, in different industries, right? And one that I've worked on is in the aviation industry to screen out certain traits in pilots. And we have one already built, but it has not been released as yet in industry to detect fraud, inside investment fraud in Canada. So perhaps, yes, maybe within the next 24 months, that software will be out there for the public to use.
And really as well, if we take it even one step further, screening processes writ large are in place now and are used on a daily basis. So there's individuals that are screened in and screened out of roles based on, what are proven and supported by data, psychometric evaluations. So it's not so much that these things are arbitrary. They've been tested scientifically. They have a rigor. There is a standard for them. And so you're screening folks in and out based on those metrics. And that's not to take away the freedom of organizations. As Mark has said, I can say, from a firsthand experience, previously I was a chief security officer for an organization, had an individual who had a drunk driving conviction. So obviously a drunk driving conviction shows up in their security assessment. Their job was not to be a driver, and having a drunk driving conviction doesn't necessarily point to issues of lack of reliability or integrity, these sorts of things. So you have to take that data, you have to sit back and you have to work with your HR professionals and you have to see what that means on the balance for somebody's position and whether you're going to, again, assume or accept that risk on those case-by-case basis. Even somebody from an insider threat perspective, if there was no world where they were going to be in a position where they could potentially compromise data, an organization might take the risk to bring them on regardless. It's more to give people a threat indication, because again, it's about that if you're in a zero threat environment or a zero trust environment versus setting different thresholds for what those things might look like. To the other question there, Lionel, about the the problem with profiling, it tends to create a bias against those. I would disagree with that. I would say having somebody complete a psychometric test gives you a read of what the personality is. In the case of if we're looking at personality and social bonds, it doesn't create a bias. It just simply says what the personality is. This already exists in, for example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a psychometric evaluation used in a number of organizations for certain roles. It doesn't say somebody's good. It doesn't say someone's bad. It just says this is who they are. It's the organization that then makes a determination based on risk scores as to what they're looking for and what that means. So it's not a bias. It's just an indication by using something that is indeed a scientific metric.
And just to follow up, Bill, absolutely. So, we've provided an example here, but the algorithm will spits out a score, right? Could be 3, it could be 4, whatnot. It's up to the organization now to use that information to determine what they want to do with it. And just to go back on the question on whether one of these has been implemented for the past 24 months, as Bill said, we have had a lot of these in different domains. So if you look at, for example, psychopathic checklists, these are out there already to determine, criminal offending population in certain sectors, right? So they are already being used. It's just that no one has ever bring it back into government or into industry, right? As far as I know. And another key point here is we're dealing with accuracy. When you build an algorithm, it will give you the way you measure the success of the algorithm is through the accuracy. And the algorithm will never going to give you 100% accuracy. So it'll be like 90%, right? Or 85%. Your job is to take the key features that the algorithm used to predict whatever you want to predict and analyze those features. So let's, again, here, it could be that I'm just hypothetically speaking of this. It could be that the algorithm cited narcissism as a key trait, right? It could be that the algorithm cited people with within a certain age group, right? Let's say 35 to 40, right? That's 2 features. It could be the algorithm cited people who have a college degree in a certain discipline, maybe business degree, for example, right? That's 3 features right there. So the algorithm will give you the top 8 or 9 features, 10 features that you want to work with. Again, it's up to the organization to take these features and investigate them further before bringing somebody on board.
Michael, you had a question about credit checks.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There was a slide earlier said insider threat to the government. One of the things I noticed is that the majority of the cases here had to do with selling secrets and fraud in general, financial fraud. So what I'm trying to understand here is, mandatory credit checks are part of the security screening, but how much correlation is there with financial troubles and insider threats? Because these personality traits, I think that's valuable information, but I'm just wondering, is there not a strong correlation to financial problems with a lot of these cases?
No, it's such a neat question.
Yeah.
I want to make the distinction between the requirements of a security screening program versus what we're looking at for insider threat. That's not to say there isn't necessarily a correlation between excessive spending habits and whatnot and certain behavioral traits and what that means from a financial crime perspective and fraud. And Mark can speak a lot more about that than I can. But just to make sure there's a distinction between those, because what happens from a security screening perspective and credit checks is an assessment of a potential vulnerability. So can you be exploited because you have a debt? Could I act as a foreign agent from a different country and actually say, look, I'll pay off your gambling debts. You're going to give me information on X, Y, Z, right? And so that goes into the loyalty to Canada and the potential for exploitation against the individual. Very separate from somebody who is also a gambler, and that leads to different personality problems, the compulsions, addictions, et cetera, and what that means for an organization. So just a bit of a distinction between the two. Mark, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, there is. The research has shown that, Michael, the research has shown that there is a correlation between financial pressure, financial strain, and in the case that I've examined, fraud. So if I don't know if anybody can remember the LIBOR scandal in the UK. We did some research in that and did found that financial strain or pressure was directly correlated to that scandal or to that particular fraud. And there's another question here from Mario. If we should, you should leverage. That's absolutely the point. I don't think I would not encourage, anyone to simply look at what the algorithms say or spits out and then make your decision based on that. You are expected to leverage qualitative insights, human-centered intelligence. There is no replacement for human-centered intelligence in all of this, right? So I would strongly encourage you to triangulate the data, certainly.
Where I'd say this is separate though, and necessary, is it's an added feature. So when you're doing your nexus check, when you're doing classic security screenings, oftentimes you're run against databases that are looking at if you have terrorist links, terrorist associations, even would have been your social media posts in the case of certain enhanced checks, but they aren't looking at threat behavior beyond the fact of an association. So the work we're looking at here with insider threat is more looking at, okay, well, if you've got a certain personality profile and you've got the absence of social bonds, and again, we have to prove that first through research that, okay, this indicates a risk. Now, what does that mean? Okay, it doesn't say that you throw out existing programs, existing checks, everything else. To quote Peter Littlefield, CIO for our organization, Bill, more security is always better. It's not to say we want to live in a police state. We don't want that. I mean, one of the questions or comments earlier was about, over surveillance. I don't think it's a matter of over surveillance. I think if you've got certain metrics that can be an indicator for risk, if you don't take action, that's irresponsible for an organization, especially when you consider the level of risk associated with certain degrees of transactions.
Yeah, and think of it like this as well. I mean, as I said, the data is to provide you with insight, right? So let's look at this, for example. If you don't have the data, you have to go to one of these background check companies and do a thorough background check of the individual, perhaps very costly. Here, as I said, the data will spit out the features that you may want to further investigate, right? It could be that the data spits out something about a person's previous employment, right? You may want to investigate that further, or perhaps person's education or background in terms of university or college he or she went. You may want to investigate these things further, right? So, or previous employment, right? The algorithm will spit out these key features, which, I will encourage people to leverage rather than going on a blind research of trying to encompass everything. And mostly, if you look at the research in this, it will tell you that those things are not helpful. Blind research are not helpful, because if they were, then we would not have had this problem, so to speak, in the private as well as the government sector.
Logan, I see your hand, and then back to the chat questions.
Yeah, sorry, I should have taken my hand down earlier. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. 10-10-80 rule of rationalization. I don't know what that is, so.
Yeah, that's probably a domain-specific rule.
My apologies, I do not know what that is. Are you talking more the fraud triangle, like the 10-80-10 in the sense of instead of opportunity attitude?
No, I think that's totally different.
Rajendra, can we maybe get some clarity on your question? We're happy to engage. And Mark is an expert in the fraud triangle, so you have the right guy.
If I'm reading this question correctly, I think the problem to understand is that no one can really measure rationalization. It's a very slippery concept to measure. So despite what's out there, I would highly guard against trying to measure something like rationalization, right? The concept in itself is not subject to certain indicators. Anybody can rationalize something. So it's relative, really. What's normal to you may not be normal to me. And that's the problem. That's one of the problems with using the fraud triangle as a framework to measure whether people will commit fraud or not. I agree with the pressure motive. I agree with the opportunity motive. Certainly you can measure those things. Internal controls can certainly be measured, but research, again, an extensive research, you cannot measure rationalization. Very slippery concept.
I think I know, and Mark's going to slap me down to the earth for this. He's going to say, Bill, what are you talking about? Get in your lane. I've sat, again, informally, I can't back it up by any sort of research, but I've sat back and I've looked at the fraud triangle and what it relates to the dark triad personality traits. And I mean, in part, you could suggest that there's elements of rationalization, or rather elements of Machiavellianism in rationalization. The fact that you've got individuals, you know, I am so much better at my job. Well, actually, even, and this is where it gets so tricky, because even as I'm, you know, expounding on the, you know, what it means, there's overlap. Narcissism and Mac, right, would both be in rationalization. Rationalization, I am worth more to the company undervalues me, I'm going to show them what I can do, right? Very Machiavellian, but also very narcissistic. So again, it goes to Mark's point of, you know, you can have certain overlaps for conditions, but to actually apply a degree of scientific rigor that's going to make you be able to predict that against a person gets a bit tricky.
And another point, I think it went back earlier to what Chad, I think gentleman Chad raised a question regarding why are these frauds or insider threats so prevalent in today. And so going back to rationalization, I think, you know, we also need to understand that rationalization is only valuable if it can detect individual behavior, individual offenders, right? What if you have an entire culture that does things a certain way in an organization? You rationalize certain behavior. That's the norm. It's not an aberration from the norm. It's what you do every day, irrespective of whether it's deviant or not, but you have rationalized that, right? So again, I mean, how can you measure something like that?
I'd go to add to that as well. I think if the research that we're doing is founded, what it really serves to do from a fraud triangle perspective, and not to mix the two concepts, is to reduce the opportunity, right? If you reduce the threat risk by identifying a potential threat, you're going to reduce the opportunity the individual has to act. And so, I mean, you're going to take away one of the elements of the triangle, or rather reduce the risk associated with it, in part, not as an absolute.
I just ask you the question because when you were studying that time, there was the concept of rationalization, which always says that the principle which has been known as 10-10-80 rule. That's why I asked this question, that how do you relate that into, basically in practicality, whatever the rules are there in terms into the books may not be applied sometimes, because every time, every year, or after certain years, the technology changes. So the new thing, as you said, the new things have to come up, and the new concepts came up. So everything has to be changed accordingly. Like if you take the example of pandemic, everybody is working from home. Everybody has access still, but still companies also trust the employees to give the access at home. So these are also the valid points which we have to understand when we talk about the privacy, security, or anything like that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, that will come under opportunity, right? Detecting
Right.
internal control, circumventing internal control. But going back to rationalization, again, based on what you said, it is very difficult to measure rationalization in that context. especially now that most people are working remotely. I mean, how would you, I'm baffled to try to understand, how would you measure collusive behavior, collusive action when you're working remotely?
Yeah, that's why I asked you this question. What is your opinion about that?
So it's funny because I've not researched it, but of course, to try and make myself more informed, I've done like a 2-second Google, and I see that the 10-80-10 rule, has certain citations. Notwithstanding, I would disagree with it. There's no world where you're going to convince me that 80% of society would commit fraud if the conditions are right. No,
Exactly.
And that's the other thing. That's right there. That is right there, the fallacy of this entire argument. Because look, mostly, and I've done collected a lot of data on this, mostly what you will find in any organization is between 1 to 5% of fraud. Right now, if you have 10% of fraud in an organization, and that's normal behavior, you have a serious problem. You have a very, very serious problem, because it only takes 1 to 2% of fraud to bring down an entire organization.
True. I agree with you. I agree. Thank you for explaining.
We have 30,000 employees in my department. And again, with $180 billion budget line expenditure, if I've got a risk of 80%, we all have a collective problem here.
Yeah.
But still, if you see the books, they are like, we always see those type of topics into the books. Why are they not changing that 10-10-80 rule then?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm very surprised to actually hear that, because I don't know who is writing these books or who is giving you these guidelines. That has been debated in highly peer-reviewed conference, that this concept is no longer applicable. There should be caution in interpreting this concept. So I'm very, very surprised that you are still being asked to do this.
I have seen the books where this rule was there. Even into the CPA exams, I have seen those type of rules in the section of the privacy and I think the business ethics chapters. I have seen those type of rules still exist in their books.
And let's not be too hasty here, Mark, because if we prove our research, that certainly benefits us. If the risk envelope for an organization is 80%, we need to pump this up. I think it's maybe 90-95%.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you both of you for giving me the answer. Thank you.
Welcome.
So if that's winding us down, I just want to thank everyone very much on behalf of Mark and I for welcoming us into your place today to have this discussion. Lots of great questions, lots of great chats on the absolute importance and criticality of this. And with that, I'll turn it back over.